afternoon, everyone. Thank you. So thank you for inviting the International Committee of the Red Cross here at this event. So why is the ICRC here today? It's because the digitalization of warfare is an established fact, and it poses new risks to civilians. So just as entire societies are being transformed by processes of digitalization, so to our armed forces, their capabilities and operations. And this has important consequences for critical civilian infrastructure and for entire populations. But what we are exactly witnessing that is of particular concern. So over the past years, analysts have repeatedly raised concern about cyber operations against civilian infrastructure, power plants, medical facilities, civilian e-governance systems, private companies. These operations continue to be of utmost concern. In most cases, they unlawfully target civilians. So we have observed other worrying trends, and today I want to bring you 6 issues to your attention. So the first one is the involvement of civilians in military, cyber, and digital activities. So in other words, the civilianization of military, cyber, and other digital activities. For instance, by providing to civilians digital tools to collect actionable intelligence, or by providing civilians offensive cyber tools. These digital forms of involvement have a much lower threshold. Anyone with a smartphone can join the cyber warfare. And digitalization has also transformed the concept of remoteness. While individuals may be physically remote from the theater of hostilities, they are only one click away from the digital battlefield. And digitalization has also made it much easier to scale up any civilian involvement. A group comprising of thousands or hundreds of thousands of individuals may be formed and coordinated in a matter of hours. So international humanitarian law prescribes that parties to armed conflicts must at all times distinguish between combatants who conduct the hostilities on behalf of parties to the conflict and civilians who are presumed to refrain from doing so and who must therefore be protected against the dangers arising from the conflict. So under international humanitarian law, civilians are protected against attack unless and for such time as they directly participate in hostilities. Therefore, encouraging civilian participation in cyber activities during armed conflict could undermine the protection of civilians who must be spared from the effect of armed conflict. That's why ICRC strongly recommends states to reverse the trend of civilianization of the digital battlefield. The second worrisome trend are operations and attacks against dual-use digital technologies. From the sabotage of fiber optic undersea cables, what is called the seabed warfare, to the destruction of civilian satellite links. Dual-use digital technologies, that is, services used by both military and civilians, are constantly attacked. And here we find again the renewed pressure on the principle of distinction. If the principle applies to the distinction between civilians and military, international humanitarian law also forces the distinction between military objectives and civilian objects. Only the entire infrastructure that makes up the internet was not designed with the aim of distinguishing these two dimensions, which have a symbiotic relationship in the digital. This means that the more the military is relying on cables, satellites, and clouds that are otherwise civilian, the more likely it becomes that this kind of infrastructure will be targeted with significant adverse consequences on civilians. One way to prevent this is to separate digital infrastructures that are used by military from those used by civilians. Technically, the separation is feasible, but it's the political will that must be pushed in this direction. The third trend is the fact that digital technologies are changing the geography of conflicts. Cooperation between private technology sector and armed forces has an important impact in this respect. Think of the hosting of military assets on civilian cloud instances that are located outside the countries involved in the conflict. The question must be asked whether these cloud instances and more generally digital assets of private companies used by armed forces and based outside the countries involved in the conflict extend the scope of the battlefield. And if they do, would it be lawful for an adversary to attack these clouds? Cyberspace spans the globe with little concern for geography and borders. Linked to this, in a broader perspective, the fourth point of reflection I bring to you today is the question of whether private tech companies providing their digital goods and services to states that are parties to an armed conflict with the result of a military advantage are themselves becoming part of the conflict. In principle, private tech companies' properties are civilian objects, and workers of private tech companies are civilians. Knowing when tech companies' employees and properties are protected from being attacked under international humanitarian law, and when those protections are lost, particularly if employees directly participate in hostilities, and if company property qualify as a military objective, is paramount. Answering these questions from a legal point of view is challenging, but in practice there are operations targeting private tech companies that are perceived as conducting cyber operations in support of one warring party. A fifth trend is the provision of digital offensive capabilities from states involved into the conflict to the civilian population. The digital space and its technologies make it possible during an armed conflict to witness a conflict within a conflict that pits civilians against civilians, denial of service attacks, website disruption, misinformation, disinformation, hate speech campaigns. And this is a very worrying trend, as civilians should be spared the consequences of wars. The fact that digital tools are distributed to civilians poses other challenges. When a conflict finally comes to an end, where will those tools be? Who is tracking the distribution and proliferation of such tools? Can civilians who have been given these capabilities and trained in their use be expected to stop once political leaders agree to a peace accord? Or are there risks that these may be misused in peacetime? And finally, my sixth point is that it is no less alarming that these tools have very different qualities, ranging from well-written and tested codes to untested and buggy codes that are quickly deployed in the fog of war. The lack of thorough analysis during code production and robust assessment during testing can result in unintended consequences. Digital tools or malwares may not behave as expected, spread far behind the targeted infrastructure, and result in unintended impacts, what some call collateral damage, on civilians and civilian objects. Or they can be hijacked by other groups with other purpose in mind. In the digital sector, too, standards will have to be established in this respect. So as you can see from the 6 points I have made today, the digitalization of armed conflicts raises many challenges. In armed conflict, civilians need digital technologies for remote telemedicine, digital cash transfer, family contact, and much more. So digital technologies are exceptional assets for humanitarians striving to alleviate the suffering of populations affected by conflict and disasters. Let's make sure that digital technologies are a force for good and not a source of suffering, and that these technologies do not draw civilians closer to the inherent risk of warfare. Thank you very much for inviting us.